Okay, good morning. Today's daf is daf Samech Vav. We are at the beginning of the sixth perek of Zevachim, which starts in the middle of daf Samech Vav. Let me share my screen and we will get started. This chapter continues the topic that we've seen in the last chapter, which is namely the fact that everything you could possibly want about certain bird sacrifices, in particular a bird chatat. That's generally we're dealing with a korban olav yored, where you have where one of the birds is offered as a sin offering and the other bird is offered as a ola offering. And so when you offer the bird as a sin offering, it has its rules that we will be discussing shortly, and then there's the Ola offering where one of the birds is offered as an Ola. So let me share my screen, and we will really get started with today's daf. The Mishnah is going to now detail what invalidates a bird chatat offering. So let's take a look. First, we're going to do the bird chatat, then we'll do the bird ola. Chatas ha'of she'as'alamata. So first of all, you need to do it below the line. Remember, a regular sin offering for a kesev, a bull or a ram, a bull or a sheep, or a goat, they need to be done above the application of the blood is above the midline, and indeed for a chatas it needs to be on the four corners, on the four horns of the mizbeach. But a bird chatas is done below the line. Kamase chatas, if you do it the way you're supposed to with the procedures of the chatas, l'shem chatas, and you do it with the right intention of a sin offering, kshera. Well, now it's kosher. And Rashi tells us, Kamase chatas, malika. That means that you do the malika. That's the way you slaughter the animal with the thumb of the kohen. B'siman echad, using just one of the pipes, either the windpipe or the esophagus. V'hazah, and you do the sprinkling. Umitzui, and you do the squeezing. Those are all part of the procedures of the chatas. And if you do that, it's kosher. Now, Tosfos implicitly wonders, why is it necessary to tell us that if you do everything correctly, that it's kosher? And so Tosfos says in the first Tosfos of the perek, Kamase chatas l'shem chatas kshera, zuhi mitzvasa, that specifically this is how it's appropriate to do. But agav achrine nakte, and what comes after is why we specifically say it, meaning that we'll see that we're going to now show if you change any of these three items, so then it's going to be problematic. So if you do it, kamase chatas l'shem ola, so the one change that you make is in connection with the intention, or kamase ola l'shem chatas, or the one change that you make is with one of the procedures. Oh, kamase ola l'shem ola, or if you do both, if you change both the procedure and the intention, all of those cases, pisula, those are all going to result in an invalid sacrifice. Not only that, but asa lamala, kamase chulan, psula, that in any of these cases, if you do the blood services above the line as opposed to below the line, well, then everything is also going to be invalid. So the bottom line is when you do a sin offering, you can't change anything. Any change creates invalidity. Olas ha'of. Now we go to part 2 of our Mishnah, and we talk about the olas ha'of, so an ola offering with a bird. So olas ha'of she'asalamala, again, as is the case with large animals, the sin offering is above the line, the ola offering is below the line. When it comes to birds, it's reversed. Mm-hmm. So the sin offering is below the line, and the ola offering is above the line. So here, olas ofa asalamala, kemase ola l'shem ola, kshera. Exactly as we have in the sin offering, if you do everything the right way, well, then it's going to be kosher. Kemase ola l'shem chatas kshera. If you do, but not only that, but if you do the proper procedures, but you think about a sin offering, it's going to be kosher. Meaning, remember that when we began this entire Masechet, we saw that only when you have a sin offering or a Pesach offering is it going to be problematic if you have the wrong intention. But when you have an Ola offering, if you have the wrong intention, it will be kosher, uvilvad shelo also levalah, except that it doesn't count towards the owner's obligation. Thus, if the owner swears that he is going to bring an Ola offering and the Kohen does everything correctly except that he thinks that it was that he thinks, oh, this is a sin offering when he slaughters it. Good news that it's a valid korban. Bad news is that he has to bring a new one. Okay, so kamase chatas l'shem ola. But if instead of switching the intention, you now switch the action, and the action is like a sin offering, or kamase chatas l'shem chatas, or if you switch both the intention and the action, pisula, it's going to be invalid. Asalamata, if you do everything below the line, meaning like a sin offering instead of a ola offering in terms of where you're putting the blood, kemase chulan, in any of these above cases, pisula, meaning the location of the, not only is the procedure ma'akev, is a procedure essential, but also the location of the blood application is also essential to the validity of a bird ola offering. So now the Gemara
If he
says
says it's if he brings as an Ola and he thinks it's a chatat, the Kohen thinks it's a chatat, then it's the offering is good, but he doesn't get any credit for it. He has to bring the
that's
owner.
correct. That's
But
right. It's a valid ola. It's a valid ola. It gets all burned on the
right, right.
altar, but the owner need if the owner was just
But
said,
but but
I'm
but but he's
bringing,
not bringing it as a chatat. So what's I mean he think, but the owner's intention was to bring it as an Ola. So what is he losing? What is the owner losing?
the owner is losing the following. If he made a commitment to bring an Ola and he says, quote unquote, I'm not saying it, but the person says that he is going to be obligated to bring an Ola, well, then he has not fulfilled that obligation with this sacrifice, even though this sacrifice is considered a kosher Ola. So he needs to bring a new one. On the other hand, if he had said that this animal will be an Ola, well, then that animal no longer exists. And so as a result, there's no further ramifications. But the point is that if he had some level of obligation, whether it's an obligation, an internal obligation, or, for example, if when we're dealing with a bird Ola, often those are done as a pair. So, meaning there's an actual obligation to bring the bird Ola. So, for example, if a person is moderately wealthy and he's subject to a korban Ola v'yored, he brings two birds. One is an orlo, one is a chatas. And if the Kohen got confused as to which was which, and he was thinking with respect to the Ola offering that it was the sin offering, it's still going to be a valid bird offering, but he's going to need to bring a new bird to satisfy the Ola obligation associated with his korban Ola v'yored.
But it's not as significant as a chatat, where he has to bring a chatat for a sin he committed, right? So,
Correct,
but
correct.
in
I
that
mean,
case,
well, remember, a korban Olav Yored is for a sin that he committed, so
oh,
there is an element to that. Remember, the four sins
right.
that one is subject to a korban Olav Yored. So there is a little bit about that. That's why I put it in that context. The two main contexts for where this would matter is in the context of a korban Olav Yored, where there's actually an obligation to bring an Ola bird, because the middle level of an ola v'yored, the adjustable sacrifice, is two birds. One as an ola, one as a chatas. And then the second situation is where one obligates oneself to bring the ola sacrifice, and that's going to be true for a big animal or a bird. That if one says that they're going to bring in an ola sacrifice, then then the kohen thinks it is a chatas, it's going to be a valid sacrifice, meaning it doesn't get burned outside the temple. It gets burned on the altar, but it's not going to satisfy the person's obligations. Okay, so now the Gemara, as we turn to Samach Vav Amabet, asks the question. We said that we're dealing with procedures. What do we mean by that? What do we mean that you're changing the procedures and you're doing the procedure of an ola instead of a chatas, right? Because that's the case that we began with. We said chatas ha'of, that kemase, when we say kemase chatas l'shem ola, and we say kemase ola l'shem chatas, what do we mean by kemase? What are we specifically referring to? So deshani mimai. What are you changing when you're doing a sin offering when we say maase ola? So as Rashi puts it, Rashi does a very nice job here, as often. So deshane b'mai akamase ola. When we say, it's saying when we refer to doing a maase ola l'shem chatas with the intention of a chatas. Kai. That's what this phrase is going on. And what we're asking is, what aspect of the sin offering are you doing like an ola? Now, there are a lot of actions that one does. There's the malika, there is the hazah, and there is the mitzvah. And so those are some of the actions that are involved in connection with a sin offering. So what are we referring to? So ilema deshane b'malika, if you tell me that we're changing the malika, and what do we mean by that? Inema deshane b'malika, Rashi tells us shahavdil, meaning that you separate the head, meaning that you cut not just one pipe, which is a sin offering, involves cutting the windpipe or the esophagus, but you cut both of them, which is what you do for an ola instead of and not a sin offering. So if you say that it changes with Malika, Nema Deloka Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, are you telling me that this Mishnah is not like Rebbe Elazar, the son of Rebbe Shimon, as we saw previously in the last parak, that the last Mishnah, I believe, was not like Rebbe Elazar, the son of Rebbe Shimon, to Amar Shamati Shemavdilin Bechatas Ha'of, because he says that in fact you're able to do Havdalah, that you can separate the entire head from the body in the case of a bird chatas, meaning that it's okay to cut both the esophagus and the windpipe. So how can you say that we're talking about Malika? Because that would mean that our Mishnah is inconsistent. But the Gemara responds, V'lo okimna delo Rebbe Elazar b'Rebbe Shimon. But didn't we just say that it's not like Rebbe Elazar, the son of Rebbe Shimon? And Rashi explains, third line down, middle of the line, in the top of Rashi on Samach Vav Amabet. Umahadar Hashas, what the Gemara is responding is, my kashilach, why is it difficult for you? Bahai vadai pligi rabbanan aleha. Because on this topic of whether or not one can do the separation of the head in connection with a bird chatas, the rabbis clearly disagree and say that you cannot do it, that you can only cut one pipe. Vilav mi ukma stama de pirkin de leel. And didn't we just establish that one of the anonymous mishnayos in the last chapter, delo Rebbe Elazar, it's not like Rebbe Elazar, de katani, because what did that Mishnah specifically say? Hivdil b'chatas puzzle. It specifically said that if you separate the head, meaning that you cut both the windpipe and the esophagus, it's going to be an invalid offering. So there should be no problem with having our Mishnah be not like Rebbe Elazar. We just had a Mishnah in the last chapter that was not like Rebbe Elazar. So lo, meaning what is, as Rashi says, first end of the first narrow line in Rashi, lo, kolomar, hachafilu Rebbe Lazar. No, we can say that this Mishnah really does go with according to Rebbe Lazar. And Dishani Bahazah. And the change that we're talking about is not with respect to the Malika, but with respect to sprinkling. Now, sprinkling is something that is required with respect to a sin offering, but is not part of the process for a Ola offering. So what we're talking about, Deshani Bahazah, second end of the second line, second narrow line in Rashi, Shalo Hazah, that you didn't do any sprinkling. Elamitza, you only did the squeezing. Shahamitzui, he avodas ha'ola. Because the squeezing alone is how one does the Ola offering. So unlike the sin offering. So as a result, maybe that's what we're talking about. So, and Hachinami Mistabra, back into the Gemara, we are the end of the fourth line, beginning of the fifth line, Hachinami Mistabra, and this, in fact, this approach makes sense, Midikatani Seifa, because we're going to see at the end of this Mishnah, right, at the end of that statement, what do we say? Asalamala Kamase Kulan Psula, that if you do the above, right? What do we say? This is the language literally from our Mishnah. At the end of the discussion of the sin offering, it says that if you do the thing, whatever the change is, above, but you do everything else like any of the previously mentioned actions, pisula, it's going to be invalid. Well, in 1 second, va'afilu kamase chatas l'shem chatas. And that's even if you do everything like a sin offering, meaning all the procedures are right. The only thing we're changing is the location. And 1 second, deshani b'mai. But what is it that we're changing the location for? Because deshani b'malika, you want to tell me that we're changing the location for malika? Ha'amar mar, we had a brisa that said malika b'chol mako b'mizbeach sheira. Where you do the malika doesn't matter on the mizbeach. So as a result, it can't be that the change action is just the malika. Elav deshani b'hazah. So what is it that we must be referring to? We must be referring to the sprinkling. Umidiseifa b'hazah, and since the end of the statement is about sprinkling, Reisha Nami Bahaza. We could say that the beginning must also be referring to the sprinkling. And when we say that there's a changed action, we're saying that the change is not doing the sprinkling in the proper location, or not doing the sprinkling at all. So Midi Irya, 1 second, the Gemara responds, is you think that's a proof? Hakadisa, hag v'hakadisa. We could say the following, as Rashi explains it: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines down. Hakadisa v'hakadisa. Kol chada v'chada. Each one of these, each piece of our Mishnah, b'madahavi shinoi legabe. It's Myri. I'm sorry, legabe. That each one is talking about its own change. Myri Resha. I'm sorry, how do we read it? Kol chada v'chada b'dahani b'madahavi shinoi legabe Myri. So that each one is speaking about its own item. Resha de Myri b'shinoi maaseh ika lamemer de b'malika nami iri. That when it comes to the change in the beginning, we could say that it's even talking about malika, and our Mishnah is just not like Rabbi Lazar. And Seifa, Demaisa, Demalika, Lo Havishinoi, Titukam Bahazah. And in the Seifa, where Malika could not be the change, because it would be kosher if you do the Malika in the wrong place, so it must be talking about Hazah, the sprinkling. So as a result, in the end, our Gemara shows that this is not a definitive proof, and we can even say that the Resha is talking about Malika, and then the Seifa is talking about Hazah. Okay, so now we're going to turn
So that could be
to
done in any place or in
the
any.
Malika can be done in any place, meaning
Now,
any place on the Mizbeach,
the
but
Haza'ah.
the Hazah needs to be done If it's a chatas, it needs to be done below the line.
Well,
And so that's what it's saying when we say that you did something above, but everything was in the right location and right intention. That's still going to be puzzle. It must be referring to the hazah, the sprinkling. Okay. So olas ha'of. So now the Gemara continues. We're at the two dots that we're saying that it's talking about a bird ola, and our Mishnah went through all the different cases where it would be kosher and where a change would cause it to be puzzle. So again, the Gemara asks, Deshani b'mai, what change are we talking about? So Ilema Deshani b'malika migatani seifa. But one second, if you say that we're talking about a change in malika, we have a problem because in the end, right? So what would be the change of malika? Malika of an ola is supposed to cut two things. If we change the malika, it means that you're cutting just one pipe. So mikbat mikitatani seifa, but we have a the end of this Mishnah, and by the end of this Mishnah, we are referring to actually the next Mishnah, which we will learn later today. Kulan ein mitamim beveis habliya umoalin behen. That the Mishnah says, the next Mishnah says, that in all the cases of our Mishnah, that it is not going to create tuma beveis habliya. We saw this topic maybe it was a few weeks ago at this point, that in general, if you have a bird and it is a bird that's a nevela, it was not slaughtered properly, and it can create tuma, but it does
isn't a
not create.
nevela something that's found on the ground? We find it there?
Well, it could be. You could have shot it, meaning you
Right.
can shoot it with an. There are a lot of there. It's not just that you find a dead animal. It could die of natural causes. You could kill it, but the key is that you didn't kill it in the proper way of slaughtering. So in that situation, when it comes to a large animal, if you touch it, it's going to be problematic. But when it comes to a bird, it only conveys tuma if you eat it, if you swallow it, if it goes what's known as beves habliya. It's in the place of the throat. Okay, so but when we do malika on a sacrifice, because that is the proper way of slaughtering the sacrifice, even if it turns out that the sacrifice is pasul, is invalid, it's going to be a valid method. It's still going to take the bird out of the category of nevela, and meaning that it's not going to cause tuma even if one were to eat it. Okay, so kulan emetamin beves habliya. All of them do not create tuma if you were to swallow it, even though some of them are going to be puzzle. Umoalin behen. And not only are they, even if some of them are puzzle, are you going to have you're not going to have a problem of tuma, but you will have a problem of meila, meaning that if you use something that belongs to the Beis Hamikdash and you don't have the right to do so, that's a case of meila. However, there's a major exception to meila, where if somebody has the right to use it. So, for example, if Kohanim have the right to use something, well, then there is not going to be me'ila if a non-Kohen uses it. Meaning the non-Kohen can't use it because he's not supposed to. But if he uses it, since it's legitimate for someone to use it, it's not going to be considered me'ila. So, but here, in all of the cases that we're talking about, we're going to see that there is going to be me'ila. And so, as a result, Nema delo Rebbe Yeshua. But that must mean, if you're going to tell me that the change that we're talking about in our Mishnah involves changing the malika from cutting two pipes to cutting one pipe, meaning the change of the malika is from the way you do an ola to the way that you do a chatas, well then our Mishnah, Nema de lo Rebbe Yoshua, our Mishnah would no longer be like Rebbe Yeshua. De'ika Rebbe Yoshua ha'amar ein moalin. Well then, because our Mishnah says, because Rebbe Yoshua says, that when it comes to a situation where an ola is offered with the procedures of a chatas, and for the sake of the chatas, it's not going to it's going to be treated as if it were a chatas, and therefore there won't be meila. So so rather, it's got to be talking about squeezing. So as a result, it can't be that we're talking about the slaughtering. It's got to be that we're talking about the squeezing. Ema seifa olas haof asa sha'asa lamata kamase chatas l'shem chatas. But one second, this too is going to be problematic. Meaning, if it's about Melitza, well, then what about the situation where we say that one did below using the Chatas procedure for the sake of the Chatas procedure? So, meaning that the Rabbi Eliezer Omer Moalin Ba, Rabbi Yoshua Omer Ein Moalin Ba, because the end of the next Mishnah is going to tell us that if you do everything the way a sin offering is supposed to be offered, according to Rebbe Eliezer, you can still do Me'ila because it's not a valid, even though it's an Ola, it's not a valid Ola, and so as a result, it's an invalid sacrifice, and therefore it's going to be puzzle, and therefore it's nobody has any right to use it, and therefore if you go ahead and use it, it's going to be Me'ila. But Rebbe Yeshua Omer Ein Mo'alin Bo. Rebbe Yeshua says that you did not commit Me'ila. If you use the procedures of a sin offering and you have the intention of a sin offering, even though the original separation of that animal was as a bird ola, was as an ola offering. So Deshani, so that case, Deshani B'mai, that case can't be referring to Ilema B'mitzvah. You want to tell me that that's also talking about mitzvah? Amar Da'amar Rabbi Yoshua Deshani B'malika. But Rabbi Yoshua requires everything to have been done like a sin offering, meaning that it's also talking about Malika. B'mitzvah miyamar. If you were to only change the squeezing and not the Malika, would Rabbi Yoshua say that the korban changed from an ola offering to a sin offering? He certainly would not. And so as a result, it's not sufficient according to that if we were to say it's Melitza. The Elaba Malika, it's got to be Malika. And so as a result, we end up with Reisha V'Seifa B'Malika. The very beginning of our Mishnah, which we're going to say is not like Rebbe Lazar, it can be about Malika, or it can be about Hazah. The end of the next Mishnah has to be about Malika because it's clear that Rabbi Yoshua says that we're talking about Malika when we say that you change to do everything like a sin offering. It means that you're changing the Melitza, the Mitzvah, you're changing the Hazah, you're doing everything like a sin offering. Umitziyasa b'mitzvah. Whereas the middle case, again, whether that's the middle case of the beginning of the next Mishnah or the middle case of us talking about a situation where you do everything properly except that you do something above the line, all of that needs to be talking about squeezing, because if it was talking about Malika, it wouldn't be true. So as a result, we end up with the beginning of the change in the beginning of our Mishnah, of our Mishnah, the one that we just read at the beginning of the seventh chapter, excuse me, is talking about. It's got to be talking about mitzvah. I'm sorry. It can be talking about even Malika. And in the end of the Mishnah that we're about to read, it can even be it has to be talking about Malika and mitzvah. It has to be talking about everything changing. And now in the middle, you end up with the change is only about Malika, because if the change were also about I'm sorry, it has. Shoot, let me say it again. My apologies. What we end up with is that the beginning of our Mishnah is talking about even Malika. That even if you were to change Malika, that's going to be a problem, and so it's not like Rebbe Lazar. And in the end of the coming Mishnah, it's got to be talking about Malika, because Rabbi Yeshua requires that Everything needs to change in order for an ola to turn into a chatas. You can't just do parts of it like a chatas. If you did that, it would be invalid. And so as a result, and therefore it would be not only invalid, but it would result in the possibility of me'ila. And he says that if you do everything like a chatas, you don't have me'ila. So it means everything, and it includes malika. And yet in the middle, it's got to be talking about hazah, because we say that if you do everything in the proper way for a chatas, except you do it above the line, it's going to be problematic. And that's not true for malika. So it's got to specifically be talking about hazah. So we have, again, the beginning is about Malika. The end is about Malika, but the middle is about Mitzoy and Hazah. So as a result, is that what we're really saying? And the Gemara answers in yes, that's exactly what we're saying. Reisha v'seva b'malika umitziyasa b'mitzoy. And the middle, the beginning, and the end are talking about Malika because they in the first case it can even be talking about Malika, and in the last case it has to be talking about Malika, and in the middle, it has to be talking about Mitzoy.
So
So
does that
as a
involve the machshava as well? That he thinks
yes, yes,
it's a
we're gonna see that right now. It's a perfect segue into the next Mishnah.
now
So
if they okay, so I'm based on what we said. I have a question before you go on about the if the animal is puzzle for whatever reason, then that animal is not is that animal fit for the mizbeach?
we need to if the animal is puzzle, then it does not get burned. If the sacrifice is puzzle, it does not is not supposed to get burned on the mizbeach. Now there are
So if that's the
situations.
case, then why is there an issue of me'ila? Because the animal isn't even fit for the to be used. So what's you're stealing
No,
from
no. So that's a great segue to our next Mishnah, because the answer to your question is that even an invalid sacrifice, it needs to be burned, and it needs to be burned without anybody using it. And if somebody were to use it, even though it's not a valid sacrifice, and it's now supposed to be burned outside the Beis Hamikdash, that's still going to be me'ila. It still belongs to the Beis Hamikdash.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And so let's just quickly go through. So bottom line, for a bird chatas, we have malika of one pipe. We require sprinkling and squeezing of the blood. It's done on the bottom half, and you need the right intention. You have to have the chatas intention. And if you're missing any of these, it's going to be invalid. Invalid because the chatas requires everything to be done properly. For a bird ola, we're going to have the malika needs to be of two pipes. You're doing squeezing and not sprinkling, and it needs to be on the top half. Now, you're supposed to also have the intention for an ola, but we saw that if you're missing just the intention, it's still going to be a valid sacrifice, but it's just not going to fulfill the owner's obligation. If we're missing any of the other items, well, then it's invalid. Except that we're going to see if all get switched to a chatas, we're going to see that that's going to be a debate, and that's what we're going to discuss in the next Mishnah, which we were just quoting, and detailing the impact of a bird sacrifice being offered, whether it's valid or invalid. The chulan, all of these cases, aim mitamin bebeis habliya. They don't create tuma because, again, as Rashi puts it, the kulan Mishnah, it's a 1, 2, 3, 5 lines down in the wider lines at the bottom of Rashi on Samech Bava Mebet. Aval pisha nifsalu malikatan. Even though they became puzzle, malikatan mitaharatan. The malika that was done on them caused them to become tahor animals, miyadei nevela, and they are not in the category of nevela. But umoalin bahen, but you can do meila. Why? Because well, chutz mechatas haof she'asa lamata kamase chatas shel l'shem chatas. Except when you do a sin offering, where you do everything in the proper place. You do it below, You have to do the right action, and you do it in the name of the chatas. In that situation, there's not going to be meila. Why is there not going to be meila? Take a look in Rashi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down. End of the line in the wire lines at the bottom of Rashi. Chutz michatas ha'ov she'asa lamata k'masei chatas l'shem chatas deksherahi. That is a kosher sacrifice. V'yesh lo shas heter l'kohanim. And there is a moment right after everything has been done to it that it is kosher for the kohanim to eat. V'shuv ein ba me'ila. And as soon as that's the case, well, then there's no me'ila with respect to it. Afil lazar. Even if a non-kohen were to take it and use it for an improper purpose, for an improper thing. So
Why is it no meila? A Cohen has a head to use it. Oh, so it belongs to him in a sense.
exactly. So you're maybe stealing from the Kohen. And even if the Kohen makes the mistake and leaves it over, so now it needs to be burned because it once belonged to a Kohen and was once edible by a Kohen, then it's the Me'ilah concept has gone completely. So, and the key element here is that when it comes to the chatas, an of chatas, the entire animal that is left after you do all of the procedures, after you do the malika and the hazah and the mitzui, the entire animal that's left all goes to the kohen. None of it is going to be burned on top of the altar, unlike with an ola where the whole thing gets burned on top of the altar. So as a result, everything goes to the Kohen, and therefore all of it is not going to be subject to Me'ilah because the Kohen gets everything and is able to use everything. So Olas Ha'of, on the other hand, Olas Ha'of Sha'asa Lamata, if you have an Olas Ha'of, where again the Olas Ha'of is supposed to be done above, but now you did it below, and you did it Kamase Chatas, and you use the actions of a chatas, l'shem chatas, and you did it for the intention of a chatas. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Moalimba. Rabbi Eliezer says that's just a puzzle ola sacrifice. So a puzzle ola sacrifice, like a regular ola sacrifice, is subject to meila, and so this animal will too be subject to meila. Rabbi Yoshua Omer Ein Moalimba. Rabbi Yoshua says no, you are not. There's no meila. As Rashi tells us, 1, 2, 3, 5 lines up from the bottom of Rabbi Yeshua Omer Ein Moelin, de Kavan Deshina Shema, since you changed its name, Umaaseha, and its meaning that you changed the way your intention was, and you changed all its actions, Umikoma, and you changed its place, L'Shem Chatas, to make everything like a Chatas, says Chatas. It effectively became a sin offering. And you know what's true about a sin offering that's offered in a valid manner? A sin offering that's offered in a valid manner has no me'ilah because it completely goes to the Kohen. So Amar Rebbe Lazar says, I don't like your opinion, Rebbe Yoshua. I think you made a mistake. Because listen to the Kal V'chomer that I can have. Uma im chatas she'ein mo'elin balishma. That when it comes to a sin offering, which if you do it correctly, there is no me'ilah, kishashina eshma mo'alim. If you change anything, if you change its intention, and you think that you're going to do an ola, it's puzzle, and therefore there's me'ilah. So ola, shemo'alin balishma. When you have an ola, which if you offered it in its right form, in its right way, there would be me'ilah. Now you're going to change and you're going to offer it in the wrong way, and there won't be me'ilah. Kishashina eshma eino din shiyamalava. It should certainly have me'ilah if you make a change for something that if you do it in the right way, it's going to end up as me'ilah. And Rabbi Yoshua responds, no, that's not good logic. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, lo, that's not true. Ima marta bechata shashina eshma l'shem ola. When you have a sin offering that gets changed to an ola thought, Shekain Shina Eshma L'Dvar Sheyesh Bo Me'ilah. What is true about an ola? An ola is subject to me'ilah. So when you change the thought from a sin offering to an ola, well then you've changed it. You're thinking about something that is subject to me'ilah. But tomar ba'ola sheshina eshma l'shem chatas. But that's not true when you change an ola to a chatas. A chatas, you're changing your thinking to something shekain shina eshma l'davar she'ein bo meila. You're thinking about something that is not subject to meila, because if you do a sin offering in the proper way, you're not subject to meila. So Rabbi Eliezer tries again as we turn to the top of Samach Zion Amud Aleph. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Harei kodshei kodshim shechatasan shechatan b'darom ushchatan shlishem kodshim kalim yochichu. But one second, what about the following situation? If I have kodshei kodshim, which are subject to meila, and I think about them that they should be that as if it should be offered as kodshim kalim, which are not often not subject to meila. So shekain shina eshmam l'davar she'ein bo meila. You're changing it to something that is not fully subject to meila, because the part that gets eaten is not subject to meila. And yet umolan bahen. And yet, if you were to have that improper thought, and that you are changing something that is in the category of kodshei kodshim, so like an ola, and you change it with a large animal, and which needs to be slaughtered in the north, and instead you slaughter it in the south, and you slaughter it with the thought of kodshim kalim, we still say, even though now you have to essentially throw that sacrifice out, that there is still ma'ila. Avata al tisma al haola. So why should you be surprised when you're thinking about an ola? Even when you change it to think about something that is not subject to meila, namely a chatas, shiamaluba, it should still result in meila. So Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, and Rabbi Yoshua says, no, again, your analogy is imperfect, Lo, Ima Marta Bekachim Kachim Shishkatan Bidarom Mishkatan Bilshem Kachim Kalim. When you have a kachim sacrifice that you slaughter in the south rather than in the north where it's supposed to be slaughtered, and you slaughter it with the intention of kachim kalim, with for the intention of one of the sacrifices that are supposed to be edible, shekain shina eshmam devar sheyesh bo iser beheter. You're actually changing it to something that has both forbidden and permitted parts, because when you have a large animal that is kochim kalim, some of it does need to be put on the mizbeach, and those parts that need to be put on the mizbeach and cannot just be eaten are subject to meila. So Tomer ba'ola shashina eshmala davar shekulo heter. But when you talk about an ola bird that you're now changing to a sin offering bird, a chatas oaf, that isn't true, because everything, all of the entire bird that's left after you've done the blood offerings, after you put the blood on the altar, all of that bird is permitted to the Kohen. And so as a result, your second analogy is just as faulty as your first analogy. Now, we are not done with this debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. In fact, the Gemara is going to begin by citing a brisa that continues the conversation. But for that brisa and that discussion, you'll need to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf.
But if the Ola is, he's thinking about, see if he's an Ola and he thinks about a Chatat, that is,
and that is going to, if the only change is thinking about a chatas, it's going to be a valid sacrifice, but not going to count for the person's obligation. But remember, it's only if he changes only the thought. If he also changes the location or anything else, then it's going to be an invalid sacrifice.
Now if he has kata,
but if in fact,
and then he thinks he thinks about an ola.
If he changes everything, about it, and he changes everything to a chatas, then you have a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says it's still an invalid ola, and Rabbi Yoshua says no. In this case, you end up with a valid chatas offering. If you change everything from a bird ola to a bird chatas, we're going to say that actually you end up with a valid bird chatas. And therefore the entire animal becomes, after you've done the sprinkling and the squeezing of the blood, becomes permitted for a Kohen to have.
Now, if you do it in the reverse, if he has an animal is a chata and he thinks it's an ola,
Then
then
then it's completely invalid.
completely invalid because
Correct.
it has to.
Yep. And everybody would agree in that situation that there's me'ila
Um, it becomes an
because it's an
ola
invalid sacrifice.
and it's invalid completely.
Correct. The only thing that you would have, the only quote unquote validity that would be part of it was that that bird sacrifice would still not create tuma through being swallowed. It's still outside the category of nevela because malika was done to it in a situation where you're supposed to do malika. Might not even be the right kind of malika. Indeed, you did the wrong kind of malika, but you still did malika, and malika will take the animal out of the tuma category, out of the category of nevela.
But but the animal is puzzle, right?
But the animal is puzzle, and it needs to be burned outside the Beit Hamikdash.
Well, what is the case where the animal is puzzle but ein bo kare? That only refers to the behemoth, not to the oaf, right?
What do you mean by Ainbo Kare?
No, we have
Ainbo
it.
Ainbo
My
Kare is a concept when we talk about
behemoth.
when we no, but the concept of karate for eating a an invalid sacrifice is only in the case of pigel.
Right, piggle, right.
Right.
But
So in any other case, if the problem isn't a piggle problem, well then if you eat it, you're not going to be subject to kares. It's still prohibited to eat, but that's what we're talking about. When we say ainbo kares in connection with the puzzle but ainbo kares, it means that there's some invalidity beyond the invalidity of piggle. That piggle is that you have the thought about the
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 zman.
wrong zman. But if you also have the thought about eating it in the wrong place,
Right,
or
right,
etc., or you do something that's wrong, in any of those cases, even if you had the piggle thought also, in all of those cases, we
right,
say puzzle be'ain bo karis. That's what that's
right,
referring to.
right. So in the case of we think it's a
But in this case, we're not dealing. We're none of the isser, none of the problems that we're talking about at the moment are piggle problems.
right.
Those we dealt with in the last chapter with
That's
respect
right.
to the
That's right.
bird offering.
So if it's
Now we're focused on non-piggle problems that create a problem. So all of these will be ainbo kares and will because they're not piggle.
but yeah, piggle does apply to an oaf as well, doesn't it?
Yes, yes,
But-
absolutely. That
Right,
was we saw that at
right,
the very end of the last
right.
chapter of the
That's
sixth
right.
chapter. So 100% it does apply to an oath, but but when we say the specific issues that we're dealing with here are the wrong intention, meaning you have in mind the wrong carbon, not the wrong time or the wrong place. And we're talking about a situation where you do the wrong thing. And again, piggle does not involve doing the wrong thing. In fact, piggle only exists if you do everything else correctly. And the only issue is your thought about the wrong time.
Right, right. So we get
So none of these invalidities that we're talking about right now involve piggle. And so as a result, all of them would be puzzle the ainbo kares if you were to eat it.
so in this the chatas, you think about an oaf, it's puzzle. Oaf,
Ola. Ola is
oh,
what I think you mean. Chatas, and you think about an ola, it's puzzle.
ola, right, it's
Right.
puzzle. And ola, you think about chata.
Chatas, it stays as an ola, assuming you do everything else correctly, but it does not fulfill the owner's obligation.
I'm just thinking about there was a situation. I thought there was a case where a chatat becomes an ola, and it would be still valid, but I guess not. I don't
No,
know what I'm
I'm not
thinking.
aware of that
I don't
situation.
know but an ola becomes a chatat. It can be used.
So again, according to Rabbi Yoshua only, Rabbi Yoshua says, you know what? If you think about, if you have an ola, and you do everything to this ola sa'of, to this bird ola, and you do everything to it as if it were a sin offering, remarkably, again, we're going to see this, God willing, in the Gemara tomorrow, that we're going to see that it actually becomes an actual chatas, an actual sin offering, and therefore is a valid sin offering. Remarkable. All
That's
right.
according to Rabbi Yoshua.
According to Rebbe. Sure, exactly. All right.
All
Have
right.
a wonderful, wonderful day. Looking forward to continuing our learning tomorrow.